The wind was a predator, a thing of teeth and ice, and Alara was its prey. It tore at the thin wool of her shawl, stealing the last of her warmth with a ravenous howl that echoed the emptiness in her own heart. Each step was a plunge into a world of blinding white, the snow a churning sea that threatened to swallow her whole. In her arms, bundled against her chest, was the only thing that mattered, the only reason her legs still moved when every fiber of her being screamed for the sweet, final surrender of sleep. Her son, Samuel, was a fragile ember of life cupped in her freezing hands, and she was the failing shield against the blizzard's fury. The cold was a physical weight, a crushing hand pressing down on her, leeching the strength from her bones and the hope from her soul. She had fled into the teeth of the storm, believing the unforgiving wilderness was a kinder master than the man she had called husband. Mr. Blackwood's cruelty was a slow, creeping frost that withered everything it touched, and she had chosen the sharp, honest violence of the mountain over the suffocating poison of his possession. But the mountain was winning. Her thoughts grew sluggish, coated in the same ice that clung to her eyelashes. The world narrowed to the rasp of her own breath and the faint, whimpering cries of her baby. This, she thought with a clarity that was terrifying, is how it ends. Not in a warm bed, but buried in a nameless drift, a forgotten footnote in a vast, indifferent landscape. It was then, as her knees buckled and the last of her resolve crumbled into dust, that she saw it. A light. It was a pinprick of impossible gold in the swirling gray twilight. A promise so faint it could have been a hallucination born of desperation. It was a star fallen to earth, a single, defiant spark against the overwhelming darkness. And it was enough. With a final, guttural cry that was more prayer than sound, she staggered toward it, her entire existence focused on that one distant, golden promise. She was no longer a woman, but a mother, and a mother's love was a fire that even this storm could not extinguish. She had nothing left but her faith and her baby, and she would carry them both into that light, or die trying. Have you ever stood at the edge of an abyss, where the darkness is so complete that you forget the very memory of light? Have you ever felt a cold so profound it seeps not just into your bones, but into the very essence of your spirit, freezing the hope within you? This is a story for those who have. It is a story about a woman who had lost everything but the child in her arms, and a man who had built a fortress around his heart to keep the world out. It is a story of how, in the heart of the most unforgiving winter, two broken souls found a warmth they thought was lost to them forever. It begins, as so many stories of survival do, with the closing of a door and the flicker of a lonely lantern against a sea of impossible snow. The man who saw her fall was a creature of the mountain, as weathered and solitary as the ancient pines that stood guard around his cabin. Silas had made a covenant with silence years ago, sealing it with the ghosts of a wife and daughter taken by a fever that had swept through the valley like a scythe. He had retreated into the high country, building a life from solitude and routine, his heart a plot of frozen ground where nothing had grown for a long, long time. He did not want company. He did not want complications. But he was, at his core, a man of honor, and honor did not permit him to watch a woman and child perish on his doorstep. He saw her silhouette, a fragile specter against the white fury, and then he saw her collapse, a small, dark heap in the snow. A curse, low and rough, escaped his lips. He pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed the lantern that had been her beacon, and plunged into the storm. He reached her in moments, his long strides eating up the distance. He knelt, the lantern light illuminating her pale, snow-dusted face and the precious bundle clutched to her chest. A baby. The sight was a physical blow, a phantom limb aching with a loss so deep it was part of his marrow. For a moment, he froze, the past and present colliding in a maelstrom of grief. Then, the baby let out a thin, wavering cry, and the sound shattered his paralysis. He scooped them both into his arms, the woman's slight weight a startling contrast to the solid, unyielding reality of his life. He carried them back to the cabin, the wind fighting him every step of the way as if trying to reclaim its prize. He kicked the door shut, plunging the cabin into the warm, fire-lit dimness, and the world of ice and wind was finally, mercifully, shut out. He had brought the storm inside, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the blizzard ever could, that nothing would ever be the same again. Alara awoke to the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee, a warmth seeping into her limbs that felt like a forgotten dream. For a long moment, she lay still, adrift in the soft comfort of a real bed, beneath a heavy quilt that smelled of cedar and thyme. Her first thought, a bolt of pure panic, was for Samuel. She sat up, her head swimming, and saw him immediately. He was sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle, a sturdy wooden crate lined with soft furs, placed near the hearth where a great fire crackled and danced, casting long, friendly shadows on the log walls. A man sat at a simple wooden table, his back to her, his shoulders a bulwark against the world. He was cleaning a rifle, his movements economical and precise. He was large, dressed in buckskin and flannel, and the very air around him seemed charged with a quiet, formidable competence. He had not heard her stir. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She had traded one cage for another, one man's tyranny for another's isolated domain. She clutched the quilt to her chin, her knuckles white. Where am I?" she asked, her voice a dry whisper. He did not startle. He simply stopped his work and slowly turned his head. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, framed by a dark, untrimmed beard and hair that brushed his collar. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and startlingly clear, and they held a sorrow so deep it seemed to absorb the light. He looked at her, then at the sleeping baby, and then back at her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. The words were simple, but they landed in her soul like a bomb. Safe. It was a concept she had almost forgotten. He stood, and she flinched, but he only moved to the hearth, ladling a fragrant stew into a wooden bowl. He placed it on a small stool beside the bed, along with a tin cup of water. "Eat," he commanded, not unkindly. "You need your strength." He returned to his table, his back to her once more, granting her a privacy she desperately needed. She ate, the warm, savory stew chasing the last of the chill from her body. She watched him, this silent, solitary man who had plucked her and her son from the jaws of death. He said nothing more, and she asked nothing more. The questions could wait. For now, there was only the sound of the crackling fire, the howl of the wind outside the sturdy walls, and the steady, miraculous rhythm of her sleeping child's breath. In this small, isolated cabin, surrounded by a world of white, Alara felt the first, fragile seed of security begin to take root in the barren soil of her heart. It was a terrifying and wondrous feeling, and she did not yet know what to do with it. The storm did not relent. For 3 days and 3 nights, it held the world in its grip, isolating the small cabin as completely as if it had been set adrift on a frozen sea. The world outside the 2 small windows was a maelstrom of white, a constant, hypnotic swirl that erased the landscape and muffled all sound save for its own mournful song. Inside, a different kind of world was taking shape, a world built of silence, routine, and unspoken things. A fragile ecosystem of 2 strangers and a baby, bound together by the whims of nature. Silas was a man of few words, and Alara, whose words had so often been used as weapons against her, had learned the value of silence. Their communication was a language of action. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and sure as he stoked the fire back to life. He would venture out into the gray light to check his snares and chop wood, returning with his eyebrows and beard laced with frost, a brace of rabbits in his hand. Alara would wake to the smell of fresh coffee and the warmth he left behind. Her days settled into a rhythm dictated by Samuel's needs. She fed him, changed him, and held him close, murmuring the soft reassurances that were the universal language of mothers. In the quiet moments while he slept, she would take a broom to the hearth or mend a tear in Samuel's blanket, small domestic acts that felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. She learned the man, Silas, in quiet observations. She saw the way his large, calloused hands could be surprisingly gentle as he carved a piece of wood. She noticed the small, almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when he glanced at Samuel sleeping in his crate cradle. She saw the ghost of a pain that lived behind his gaze, a permanent shadow that the firelight could not touch. One afternoon, while Silas was outside, she found a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird tucked away on a high shelf. It was worn smooth, as if held by small hands for many years. When Silas returned, she was holding it, her heart aching with a sudden, intuitive understanding. He saw the bird in her hands and froze, the Arctic air still clinging to his coat. For the first time, she saw the fortress around his heart crumble, revealing the raw, unguarded grief beneath. He didn't speak. He simply took the bird from her, his fingers brushing hers, and placed it back on the shelf, his movements filled with a reverence that was more eloquent than any words. He turned away, but not before she saw the glisten of moisture in his winter sky eyes. In that shared, silent moment of understanding, the space between them changed. It was no longer the space between a rescuer and a victim, but between two people who recognized the shape of loss in each other. The trust that had been a tentative seedling was sending down deeper roots, nourished not by words, but by the quiet communion of shared sorrow and the steady, life-affirming presence of a child's peaceful sleep in a warm, safe room. The fever came on suddenly, a thief in the night. One moment, Samuel was sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The next, he was wailing, his skin hot to the touch, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Alara's blood ran cold. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered, replaced by a primal, suffocating terror. Out here, miles from any doctor, a fever could be a death sentence. She did everything she could think of, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth, trying to coax him to nurse, but the heat only intensified, and his cries grew weaker, more frightening. She was losing him. The despair was a physical thing, a black wave threatening to pull her under. Silas, who had been sitting by the fire, was on his feet in an instant, his usual stoicism gone, replaced by an expression of grim focus. He placed a hand on Samuel's forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle, and his jaw tightened. "The fever's high," he stated, his voice low and steady, cutting through her panic. He moved with a sudden, new purpose. He grabbed a small leather pouch from a hook on the wall and pulled on his heavy coat. "Keep him warm, but not too warm. I'll be back." Before she could even ask where he was going, he was gone, plunging back out into the storm which still howled with unabated fury. Alara was alone with her sick child and her spiraling fear. She held Samuel close, rocking him, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. It felt like an eternity, each minute stretched thin by the sound of Samuel's labored breathing. She imagined Silas lost in the storm, imagined herself alone when the worst happened. But then, the door burst open in a swirl of snow and frigid air, and he was back, his beard caked in ice, his chest heaving. In his hands, he clutched a small bundle of dark, gnarled roots. He didn't waste a moment, moving to the hearth where a pot of water was always simmering. He crushed the roots with the hilt of his knife, dropping them into the water. A sharp, earthy smell soon filled the cabin. "Willow bark," he explained, his voice still tense with urgency as he strained the liquid into a cup. "It will bring the fever down. My wife used it." The mention of his wife hung in the air, a confession of his deepest wound, offered in a moment of crisis. He helped Alara sit Samuel up, and with infinite patience, they used a small spoon to get a few drops of the bitter tea into the baby's mouth. They worked together through the night, a silent, determined team. He kept the fire roaring, and she kept the cool cloths on Samuel's head. They took turns holding him, murmuring soft words of comfort. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, she felt it. The heat radiating from Samuel's small body was lessening. His breathing grew deeper, more even. By the time the sun was fully up, the fever had broken. He was sleeping, truly sleeping, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. Alara began to weep, silent, racking sobs of relief and exhaustion that she could no longer hold back. Silas stood awkwardly for a moment, then he did something that stunned her. He reached out and placed a large, warm hand on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of pity, but of solidarity, of shared victory. "He's strong," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Like his mother." She looked up at him through her tears, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic protector to the kind, honorable man beneath. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. the question that had been sitting on her heart for days. He looked at Samuel, then at the small wooden bird on the shelf, and the answer was there, in his haunted, winter sky eyes. "Because no one was there to help me," he said, his voice barely audible. "And a man has to do what's right." In that moment, the last of her fear washed away, replaced by a profound and overwhelming gratitude. She was not his prisoner. She was his guest. And in this desolate, frozen wilderness, she had found the one thing she thought she'd never find again: a good man. The storm passed as abruptly as it had arrived. One morning, Alara woke not to the howling of the wind, but to a profound and brilliant silence. The world outside the window was transformed, a pristine wilderness sculpted from snow and bathed in the clean, sharp light of a winter sun. The immediate danger of the blizzard had passed, and with it, the suffocating sense of entrapment. But a new kind of tension settled over the cabin, heavier and more foreboding than the storm clouds. The end of the storm meant the world could once again intrude. It meant that the roads, however impassable they seemed, would eventually clear. It meant that a man like Mr. Blackwood, a man of resources and relentless will, could resume his search. The sanctuary was no longer absolute. That afternoon, Silas returned from a long circuit of his property, his face set in grim lines. He didn't speak at first, just leaned his rifle against the wall and stood by the door, staring out at the vast, snow-covered expanse. "What is it?" Alara asked, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "Tracks," he said, his voice flat. "Down by the creek. 2 riders. They came up the valley and turned back." He looked at her, his gaze direct and somber. "They're looking. It's only a matter of time." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. The found family they had started to build, the quiet rhythm of their life, was built on borrowed time. The narrator's voice would paint a portrait of the coming threat, a stark contrast to the quiet honor within the cabin. It would describe Barnaby Blackwood, not as a man, but as a force of acquisitive greed. He was a man who had built an empire on the backs of others, a man for whom people, like land and livestock, were things to be owned. Alara, with her education and quiet dignity, had been his finest acquisition, a testament to his status. Her defiance was not just an affront. It was a breach of contract, a theft of his property. The child, Samuel, was merely an extension of that property, a legacy to bear his name. Blackwood was not driven by love, for he was incapable of it. He was driven by a possessive rage and a deep, narcissistic wound. He would not be made a fool of. He would scour the entire territory, burn it to the ground if he had to reclaim what was his. His cruelty was not born of passion, but of a chilling, transactional entitlement. He was the embodiment of the cold, calculating ambition that sought to tame the wild frontier, not by living with it, but by breaking it to his will. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere grew heavy with this unspoken knowledge. Every snap of a twig outside, every shadow that moved at the edge of the clearing, was a potential threat. Silas began to spend more time cleaning his rifle, his movements deliberate and focused. He taught Alara how to load and fire a small pistol he kept in a drawer, his hands brushing hers as he showed her how to hold it steady. The lessons were practical, grim, and a silent acknowledgement of the future they both saw coming. The slow-burn romance of their shared solitude was now overlaid with the tension of a coming war. The quiet glances were now laced with fear for each other. The simple act of sharing a meal became a prayer for one more day of peace. They were no longer just 2 strangers sheltering from a storm. They were allies, preparing to make a stand against the darkness they both knew was coming for them. They came at dawn, when the light was gray and uncertain, painting the snow in shades of blue and violet. Silas was already awake, a sentinel at the window, as if he had sensed their approach in his sleep. He saw them first, 3 figures on horseback cresting the ridge, dark silhouettes against the rising sun. "He's here," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. Alara, who had been nursing Samuel by the fire, felt her heart seize. She looked at Silas, and the quiet rancher was gone. In his place was a soldier, his eyes cold and hard, his entire being focused into a single point of deadly intent. He handed her the pistol. "Take Samuel to the root cellar. Bar the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." His words were a command, leaving no room for argument. But as she took the pistol, her hand trembling, she looked at the man who had saved her, who had nursed her child, who was now preparing to face down a tyrant for her, and she found a strength she never knew she possessed. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "We faced this together." A flicker of surprise, of something akin to admiration, crossed his face. He gave a curt, single nod. The riders drew closer, and Alara could make out the man in the lead. Mr. Blackwood, dressed in a fine, city-made wool coat that looked absurdly out of place in the rugged wilderness, his face a mask of smug certainty. He reined in his horse a stone's throw from the cabin, flanked by two rough-looking men with rifles resting on their saddles. "Alara!" Blackwood called out, his voice dripping with condescending ownership. "This foolishness is over. Come out and bring my son. I'm prepared to be lenient." The door of the cabin opened, and Silas stepped out onto the porch, his long rifle held loosely at his side. He stood between Blackwood and the cabin, an immovable object. "She's not going anywhere," Silas said, his voice a low growl that carried easily in the crisp morning air. "And he is not your son in any way that matters." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And who are you? Some mountain savage who fancies himself a hero? I am Barnaby Blackwood. That woman is my wife, and that child is my property. Step aside, or my men will remove you." "She's not property," Silas said, raising the rifle so it rested in the crook of his arm. "And you're not welcome on this land." The tension snapped. One of Blackwood's men, impatient, raised his rifle. In a movement too fast to follow, Silas's rifle was at his shoulder, and a single shot echoed through the valley. The man's rifle flew from his hands, his fingers stung and useless. The second hired gun hesitated, his eyes wide. Blackwood's face contorted in a mask of fury. "Kill him!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with rage. But as the second man took aim, the cabin door creaked open again. Alara stood there, the small pistol held in both hands, her aim steady on Blackwood. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fire he had never seen before. "Get off this land, Barnaby," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Or so help me God, you will not leave it alive." It was no longer a damsel in distress speaking. It was a survivor, a mother, a woman who had found her power. The standoff was absolute, a triangle of deadly intent. Silas, the stoic protector. Alara, the resilient survivor, now a hero in her own right. And Blackwood, the tyrant, suddenly realizing his money and his name meant nothing here, in a place governed by a more fundamental law of courage and conviction. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final, bloody confrontation. Blackwood stared at Alara, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. He saw not the meek, subservient woman he had married, but a stranger, a formidable adversary. This defiance, this utter rejection of his authority, was more enraging than her flight. It was an attack on the very foundation of his world. "You would choose this? This nothing?" he spat, gesturing with contempt at Silas and the simple cabin. "Over me? Over everything I gave you." "You gave me a cage," Alara replied, her voice unwavering, the pistol still trained on his heart. "He gave me safety. You gave me fear. He gave me respect. There is no choice to be made." The raw, simple truth of her words seemed to strike Blackwood with more force than a physical blow. Humiliation, an emotion he was entirely unfamiliar with, warred with his rage. He looked from Alara's resolute face to Silas's cold, deadly calm, and for the first time in his life, he felt outmaneuvered. He was a man of the city, a creature of contracts and intimidation. Here, in the stark honesty of the wilderness, his power was an illusion. The second hired gun, seeing his employer's hesitation and the two weapons trained on them, slowly lowered his rifle. He had been paid to intimidate a runaway woman, not to die in a shootout with a mountain veteran and a she-wolf protecting her cub. "It ain't worth it, boss," the man muttered, already backing his horse away. The betrayal was the final straw. Blackwood, blinded by a torrent of impotent fury, drew his own ornate pistol and fired wildly toward Silas. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of snow. In the same instant, Silas's rifle barked again. It was not a killing shot. It was a shot of pure, calculated skill. A shot that tore through the expensive fabric of Blackwood's coat sleeve and grazed his arm, just enough to send a shock of white-hot pain through him and make him drop his weapon. He cried out, a pathetic, wounded sound. Silas worked the lever of his rifle, the metallic click and exclamation point on the sentence that had just been passed. He aimed not at Blackwood, but at the ground just in front of his horse's hooves. The animal reared, panicked, and Blackwood, a poor horseman, was thrown ignominiously into a snowdrift. Defeated, humiliated, his power stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, whining man covered in snow. His 2 hired men, seeing the fight was over, didn't wait. They spurred their horses and fled back down the valley. Silas walked slowly toward the sputtering, defeated man. He stood over him, a towering figure of frontier justice. "Get up," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute command. "Get on your horse, and if you ever come back here, if you ever so much as think about her again, I will not miss." Blackwood scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm, his face a mask of hatred and pain. He stumbled to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and without a backward glance, galloped away, a tyrant vanquished not just by force, but by the undeniable power of 2 people standing together for what was right. The sound of his retreat faded, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. The smoke from the rifles drifted away on the cold, clean air. Alara finally lowered the pistol, her arms shaking from adrenaline. Silas turned to her, his face softening, the hard soldier receding to reveal the quiet, honorable man she had come to know. They stood there, on the porch of the small cabin, the rising sun casting their long shadows behind them. The threat was gone. The battle was won. They had faced the darkness together and had emerged into the light. Their future, like the endless, snow-covered landscape before them, a clean and unmarked page waiting to be written. The years that followed were etched not in dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of seasons turning. The cabin, once a simple shelter, grew and changed with them. Silas, with Alara's help, added a new room, its windows facing the morning sun. He built a sturdy porch where they would sit on summer evenings, watching the stars ignite in the vast, velvet sky. The land, which had once been a refuge for his solitude, became a homestead. A small barn was raised, its timber smelling of fresh-cut pine. A vegetable garden was tilled in the spring, its neat rows a testament to their shared labor and hope for the future. The silence of the cabin was replaced by the sounds of a family. The happy babble of a growing boy, the soft murmur of conversation, the easy laughter that now came so readily to Silas's lips. Samuel grew from a baby into a boy with his mother's thoughtful eyes and his adoptive father's steady hands. Silas taught him how to track a deer, how to read the clouds, how to carve a small bird from a piece of pine. The very bird that had once been a symbol of his loss now became a symbol of his renewal, a gift passed from one generation to the next. Alara, no longer a fugitive but a partner, found her own strength rooted in the rich soil of their life together. She filled the cabin with warmth, with the smell of baking bread, with books she had ordered from a catalog. She taught Samuel his letters and numbers, her quiet dignity and resilience a constant, guiding light in their home. The ghosts of their pasts did not vanish entirely, but they receded, their sharp edges worn smooth by the healing balm of daily love and shared purpose. Silas's sorrow for his first family was transformed into a deep, protective gratitude for his second. Alara's scars from her time with Blackwood faded, replaced by the profound peace of knowing she was cherished and safe. One autumn afternoon, several years after the confrontation, Alara stood on the porch, watching Silas and a young Samuel down by the creek. Silas was patiently showing the boy how to skip a stone across the water's surface. The man who had been a fortress of grief now threw his head back and laughed, a full, rich sound that carried on the crisp air. The boy, his face alight with joy, clapped his hands and tried again. They were not a family born of blood, but of circumstance, of courage, and of choice. They were a found family, their roots intertwined, holding each other steady against the winds of the world. They had built their happily ever after not from a fairy tale, but from the sturdy timber of honor, resilience, and a love as quiet and as strong as the mountains that surrounded them. And it was more beautiful than anything either of them had ever dared to dream. So, we come to the end of our story. A story that began in the heart of a blizzard, in the depths of despair, and found its way to the warmth of a hearth and the light of a new dawn. It is a reminder that even in the most desolate of landscapes, hope can take root. It shows us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of taking one more step, even when you are terrified. And it teaches us that the deepest wounds can be healed, not by forgetting the past, but by building a future worthy of the survival. The journey of Alara and Silas is more than just a frontier romance. It is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. It's a story about how one good person, choosing honor over isolation, can change the course of another's life forever. It's about a woman who discovered that her greatest strength was not in her endurance of cruelty, but in her capacity to fight for a life of love and peace. What storms are you facing in your own life? Where do you find your light in the darkness? The world can often feel like a cold and unforgiving wilderness, but as Alara and Silas have shown us, the warmth of human connection, of courage, and of love can build a sanctuary strong enough to weather any blizzard. If this story of hope and redemption touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even after the longest winter, the sun will rise again. And for more stories that celebrate the strength of the human heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for joining us.